This is Michael Fox, and this is the Prospector News Podcast. And joining me from down under, I have Dave Lawie, who's the Chief Geoscientist from IMDEX. Welcome to the show, Dave.
Hi, Mike, and lovely to chat to you today.
Absolutely. Now, explain to our listeners who are probably not familiar with your company exactly what IMDEX is.
The first thing I need to do is compliment you on the pronunciation of my surname. Most people get it wrong, and that was pretty good. Now, IMDEX, we're a global mining technology company. We have offices all around the world. We supply resource companies and drilling companies with sensing equipment, rock knowledge sensing equipment, and drilling fluids. Like I said, we operate everywhere. We've operated actually in your neck of the woods in Canada for a very long time. We have a very strong presence there as well. We're listed on the ASX. We have a market cap of about $1 billion. That varies around the place, of course, but around $1 billion today. We invoice in over 120 countries globally, wherever there's mining and exploration going on the planet. That's where we are supplying our mining technology equipment. And lately, the emphasis on what we're doing has been converting a lot of our technology into digital systems as well, so that we can get global visibility on it.
So at the end of November, and this is how you ended up on my radar, you guys wrote an interesting paper titled "The Problem with Copper." What can you tell me about the paper, and what is the problem with copper?
Well, to cut right to the chase, the problem with copper is not a problem with copper per se. It is securing enough of it. Most people listening to this podcast especially would be familiar with, there's a lot of discussion around the scarcity of critical minerals and rare earths, which actually aren't that rare geologically, but the name gives it that impression. Supply chains, and even in Canada, just recently, you've had the government coming out not wanting Chinese ownership of some companies which are exploring and heading to extraction of critical minerals, however they're defined. But when this conversation goes on around the critical minerals, and indeed these are needed for the future of our industrial transformation and decarbonisation, and people are thinking about lithium, cobalt, nickel, rare earths, and others, what I call the most critical element amongst those lot that's often left out of the conversation is copper. And the reason I wrote that article is that from a geological point of view, increasing the supply of those other critical elements, materials, if you like, is reasonable in the timeframes that we're talking about. Still a challenge, an unbelievable challenge, but reasonable. Whereas copper is different. It's fundamentally different. We have commercially exploited the shit out of it, to put it in Australian French, for the last 100 years. And we've been working on extremely tight supply consumption balance with copper for that time period. So the problem we have now is, even to maintain the steadily increasing demand for copper, irrespective of anything to do with decarbonisation, is a material challenge in itself to the industry. But then to go and kick the demand side equation sideways with decarbonisation by numbers which vary, but punters potentially having us needing to add, by the end of this decade, another 8 to 10 million tonnes of copper supply for the world to achieve these outcomes by 2050, this net zero. That means, another 10 million tonnes. It's a doubling, more or less, of our current production of copper. And as I said, it's incredibly difficult right now to keep the current production of copper up, let alone double it in such a short space of time, especially when it takes 20 years to go from a discovery to getting a deposit mined and the copper onto the market. And I just don't think that is generally appreciated, barely appreciated in some ways in the industry itself. Let alone the commentators that write about our industry, the finance people and the investors. And lastly, among that lot would be the general public, who I think are completely clueless with this state of affairs, and it's an important state of affairs. And that, perhaps that's on us as an industry for not having explained our importance to the world and what goes on in it over the past decades.
You would think that people would understand that a little bit more, because they referred to copper as Dr. Copper for quite a length of time, meaning that it has a PhD in predicting economic capacity and the ability to, to measure where an economy is going up or down. The general rule was Dr. Copper would take the temperature of the economy and tell you where it was. So you would think the public would understand that. Would you
Yeah,
not?
no, I think from a bellwether or harbinger of generalized industrial activity, then indeed, and I think this is part of what people don't understand, is they understand it at that level, but I'll come back to the sideways move in the demand to, if copper was to steadily, and it would, irrespective if we weren't going through decarb and the requirements of the electrification of everything, if you want to put it that way, if it wasn't necessary to go through that in the next decade, 2-3 decades, and we just kept going along the way we were, then that would be fair enough. And we would muddle along and somehow find enough copper supply to supply the traditional copper market. But even that would bring difficulty. And I think the other reason we call it Dr. Copper is it's been pretty steady, right? If you look at the consumption and supply copper graph for over the last decades, it's been so tightly matched, and the price has swung up and swung down. But the interesting thing about that is, with the prices swinging up and down, barely has any impact on supply. The lag between price impetus and copper supply coming online is up to, like I said, up to 20 years. And that's well beyond the thought processes of investors and finances and banks, etc., like that. But nevertheless, it's muddled along and just slowly kept up, and technology has actually helped increase supply. So, the giant porphyry mines in South America and elsewhere, which were driven to move ever more tons at ever lower grade to extract lower and lower concentrations of copper. But at volume has sort of, helped to supply that gap in the meantime. But a lot of those strategies are now becoming more and more unavailable, just purely for the ages of these mines, but also for geopolitical and environmental problems. But that's okay. That's the standard copper conversation. But like I said, if you're going to kick the demand from 20 to 30 million tons by the end of this decade, that is an entirely different kettle of fish. And that's just to the end of this decade. That the forecasts have us requiring more and more copper again, to even doubling the 20 to even a 40 or 50 million ton per annum requirement for copper, especially as we go through an intensive period of the changes in technology we use to generate, store, and transport power in the next decade or two. It gets up to those sorts of levels, and I look at that and I find it very difficult to see a way out of that. I'd love to hear ways out of that, and we're used to technology coming to the rescue and helping in a multitude of these types of problems. But as a geologist, I'm a geologist. I know that we have been intensively looking for copper for 100 years. We've been throwing unbelievable technology at it for the last 20 or 30 years. And we've been spending a lot of money on the exploration side of things, but perhaps not as much as we should, which would be another topic to discuss. But the success rate of finding new copper resources to bring into production has been pretty low in the last decade. And you combine that with an underinvestment in capital and existing operations to expand the production of what they know they've already got. It's a difficult needle to move. I think that's what I'm trying to make the point. To try and get that dial that's stuck on about that 20 million tons and even turn it to 25 is a hellishly difficult task. You're talking about another 10 Kamoas coming on stream just to get from 20 to 25 million tons of copper. And that, when you say it like that, or another five Escondidas, it's just, the numbers are like that. And when you think about it like that, you just go, oh my God, what can we do about this? On the technology front, there's a few things going on now in the industry. I think that's the level, or the general level, or the realization of the magnitude of the problem. That there are things happening now. And Mike Henry, BHP's new CEO, has been out saying some like some relatively important things in public which haven't really been particularly said forcefully by the industry in the past. And one of them he's been saying is that because mining is so on the nose with most people on the planet, for reasons I get sick of hearing about, right? We keep looking at the past, but governments need to get on board with the mining industry to appreciate the level of importance that mining has in the whole issue of decarb. So no mining, no additional mining, no new incredibly intensive efforts at exploration and mining and expanding existing operations. None of that. There is no decarb. You can just forget about it. And that is something that's very underappreciated in the general population. It's even underappreciated, I think, in our own industry and the industries that work with our industry and cover it, from the media, for example, Michael. But certainly in the general population, this is a very, very underappreciated problem. I was just reading something in The Economist last week, and there are ways that we can decarb. There are fascinating things going on, and they were just talking about the potential of the North Sea near the northern countries of Europe to generate wind power alone. And there are 9 countries there which have plans to build 260 gigawatts of wind generating power by 2050. Now, that's actually 5 times all of the wind generation that goes on the planet at the moment and can power 200 million homes. So these mega scale projects are being kicked around. So people are on it, if you like, you want to use the air quotes. But you can't build those things without the raw materials that's required to go into them.
And how you're going to get the power to those homes without the copper lines to move the power?
Exactly right. And when people do think about copper, they think about cabling and power and things like that, which is correct. But while the move to decarb is going on, increasing the requirement for copper, there's still infrastructure being built which uses copper as it has been using over the last 100 years. And there's, at the same time as we're going through, we're hopefully attempting to decarb, we are having an infrastructural renewal processes going on, especially in the Western world, which it alone will add increased demands on copper. So it sounds intractable, but often, and the optimist in me, Michael, thinks when things sound intractable, sometimes that's when you push technology and innovation to the limit. And so, I don't know, to get around some of these things, there are technologies kicking around, and there are things like bacterial leaching of sulfides to extract copper from things we couldn't afford to or get at the moment. A company called Jetty over there in the US. There's potentially in situ leach, so mining without opening up big holes underground. There are things like that, but again, you look at those and go, can they deliver the copper at the sheer volume that we need? Reprocessing existing tailings, which would have a double positive benefit, so extracting any copper or anything else that's in them, but also cleaning up the tailings and perhaps using the residue for that for sand for construction. I mean, there's even shortages of sand in the world at the moment, which might seem bizarre, but there's no, you can't really yet put your finger on a great technological leap which will release new sources of copper. There'll be some incrementally, copper will be made available, but then the other thing that we layer on top at the moment, in just to maintain the copper that we use currently, is just the geopolitical stuff that's going on in the world at the moment. And there was an interesting study published in the middle of last year after Russia invaded Ukraine, and what they did was they looked at the UN vote, the people who voted to censure the Russians for invading Ukraine, and those who abstained from that vote, and then coloured the world in. And I mean, you can argue with the names of these groups, but if you called them US-centric and Russian-centric in their voting intentions over Ukraine, and then you took the resources in the world and split them along those 2 geopolitical blocks, you get a very, very interesting picture of the world, and I find it quite horrifying, actually. Numbers like of all of the resources of copper in the world, 65% were aligned with the pro-protect Ukraine countries, if you like, and 35% was Russian bloc aligned. But then if you look at some of the other ones, some of them, it really gets quite interesting. So cobalt was 30% aligned with voting against the Russians, of course 70% for. REEs were 10% Western aligned, 90% the rest, and even potash, unbelievably important, was 40% that the reserves were in the Western world, if you like. So quite apart from technical challenges to maintain and incrementally increase copper, and then to actually kick the supply sideways up by that 5 to 10 million tonnes per annum in a relatively short space of time. I mean, 10 years is a very short time span to talk about copper. We have geopolitical tensions layered on top of that. And, you know, what's been going on in Peru actually currently, right now, today, last night, are not good hairbringers of a vision of stability for supply from those countries, who are very, very important. I don't think Chile itself supplies about a third, or Chile and Peru together, about a third of the copper we need in the world, you know, not being the exemplars of stability lately.
No, those are definitely the geopolitical challenges of that makes for great challenges, especially from an investment side of things. If you know, you get a movement back towards nationalism, you can't just pick up a mine and move it to another jurisdiction. It is where it is, and those history has always suggested that, you know, those are the types of assets that were ripe for nationalization. So it'll be interesting to see how that rolls out in the next little while. You were talking about technological changes, and you were talking about it strictly from the mining element and bringing more supply online. I've often wondered, you know, back when I was younger, you know, most of the plumbing in a person's house went through copper lines, and now most of that plumbing goes through PVC lines. Are we getting to a stage where maybe the technological advances are there to replace copper's traditional demands, and freeing up that supply to go towards the, you know, the decarbonization and electrification of the economy? Is that a possible use for technology?
Yeah, a diversion, I suppose you'd call it. Yeah, that's funny, Michael. I was just talking to some guys on the weekend about getting a fire mitigation system put on the roof of the house here in the Perth Hills, which are prone to fire, as you might imagine, bushfire risk. And they said you can have copper pipe or stainless steel. And by the way, stainless is cheaper. so it was quite so. And so being a good geologist and concerned about this topic, I said, yes, we'll have stainless steel. Thanks very much. Yeah, I think there are a few things like that, but it almost goes into it's not the same as recycling, but you can almost put it in the recycling activity bucket. It will always be there, and potentially either makes available or makes available again that 10 to 15% of the demand. But the demand will grow so quickly that even those things, I mean, it will all help, of course, but I don't think it can make that step change. I think they're the sorts of things that would have happened in a steady state, steady increase in copper consumption in the world, that those things would have naturally just come along, and have possibly already factored in. But like I say, the sideways boot in the requirement for copper, I don't think those things can do anything about that, which includes recycling as well, by the way.
Yeah.
I mean, if someone buys something that's recycled, it just means the next person misses out on that bit and needs something of the new copper that doesn't exist. So it's not, we've probably got 3 decades to go with copper until the recycling turns it into a circular economy, if you like.
Well, that's probably, in the eyes of the environmental movement, that's about 3 decades too long. So the short story to all of this is, if I'm reading between the lines here, this copper deficit has the potential to completely derail the decarbonization of the global economy because of you know, commodity shortage.
Yes, and yeah, so It's an interesting point in history. It's I was despairing that the planet, the politics or the politicians of the planet would come to the realization that things were getting pretty dire on the environmental front, was with global warming. At one point, I used to call it global variance, just things changing far more rapidly than they used to. I used to get lots of arguments with geologist mates over the decades, as you might imagine, because not exactly an homogenous view on this from the geoscience community. And in fact, I used to tell them that I'd still be arguing with you standing waist deep in the ocean as it rolled up the beach. You'd still be arguing against me with global warming. So I was actually quite despairing and depressed that anything would happen 10 years ago. But then I think the reinsurance industry and the insurance industry and the finance and the long-term financiers started to look and started to believe, and they started to factor things in. And then I think that train left the station without the governments actually being on board in any great way. The finance people, the money people could see the risks that were building up and were starting to do something about it. And at that point, I thought, wow, something might actually happen. We might not need to wait for the politicians to align around it. But then gratifyingly, that has happened now. But to get to this point and to get some general realization that we really need to do something, and then to run into this problem, which could potentially derail what we can do to mitigate the effects of global warming, is truly, truly horrible. I find it greatly upsetting, actually. And the reason I'm here talking to you about this, Michael, is I still think that this is, even in our own industry, let alone the outside world, underappreciated. It's just people. You look at graphs, economists and forecasters put a graph together. They add another 5 million tons or whatever is copper to a bar chart and put it in front of you and go, that's what we need. Often the people that are creating those have no concept of what it actually takes to find and define and bring these copper resources into production, like zero idea. And this at the same time when the industry is facing increasing ESG challenges around operating anywhere, frankly, is a very difficult problem. And I think, it's hard for the industry to change the outside view of itself. One thing I say about that for our industry is that you can't read the label from inside the bottle. If you're part of what's perceived to have been the problem for a long period of time, you're probably the worst placed to see a way out of it. And I think, and I don't know, I have ideas about this, might be a topic for another podcast, but I think the industry in general needs some sort of an external shock to it, to help it step up to the plate, if you like, and really change its thinking about how it's going to address this. There are a multitude of challenges for the industry to move into a different mode. Anglo's CEO said just last year that if the industry is going to take bringing the supply of copper on or increasing the supply of copper seriously, it needs a sustained price of $10,000 a ton. But that's an interesting statement, but it's a statement that's so short term, right? It just puts the long term solution to what we're doing in the very short term in the hands of the very short term market pricing. So if you're going to wait for the pricing to get to a point to make it attractive, it's possibly already too late given the long time frames involved. But it's just the way the Western economies work. In some way prevents us moving now and getting more serious about the problem.
Yeah, well, the price of copper today doesn't help 20 years from now when that mine will come on board. So
no, it really doesn't. And so
the question I have is the critical minerals. Like most countries that I see, copper isn't included on that list. Does there need to be a movement to make sure copper is on that list, so governments start to invest in speeding up the process to bring the copper online?
Well, as you might have guessed, I would agree.
Well, yeah, that was a softball question.
Look, I really think so. And I think strategically, having copper on the list will make countries think about what the geopolitical risk is of the domains where most of the copper is coming from currently, if that makes sense. Because, and this is where the economics becomes difficult. A traditional just-in-time supply chains would mean if you could bring a copper supply on stream for slightly less than you would elsewhere, then it was going to be slightly more expensive than it is currently in an existing jurisdiction, then you probably wouldn't raise the funding to do it. But I think now, thinking about the geopolitical risk and the insurance the globe needs for the supply of copper, I think some of those metrics should change. And if it was on the critical minerals list, it might give bringing additional copper supply a kick along, right? It might, presumably it's not just money involved in putting things on the critical list. It's a reduction in red tape and its acceleration through approval processes, things like that. So I absolutely think that copper should be on that list for just for the geopolitical risk associated with it in the first place.
I personally, I'm agreeing with that statement. I look at, and it'll seem like a weird, comparison, but I look at COVID and the need for a vaccine to combat the disease. They moved that along pretty quick when government got behind the push to get there. Now, yeah, there was a head start already, but they were able to get a reasonably workable vaccine with all its warts in a very quick order. And, if government gets behind and sees a strategic need for something, a lot of that red tape and things, will disappear. And then speaking of COVID, I'm guessing this is going away, but there was a talk about, even increasing copper demand by plating everything with copper because of its antibacterial properties, so that anything like a doorknob or a handle that public was going to touch on a regular basis was going to be copper. So I'm guessing with the deficit, that's not going to happen anymore.
Yeah, that's sort of odd, isn't it? And I also, traveling in South Africa, the RSA, that I have seen door handles and knobs copper plated for that very reason, and actually have a sign next to it saying why they're copper plated. But yeah, it would be interesting to think about what the demand of that copper would be if we're going to go and copper plate all the doorknobs and door rails and stair rails and things on the planet, if we would have another outbreak or something even worse than COVID. I've got no idea, actually, but it's an interesting use case. And in a super constrained environment, then it's possible at some point in the future choices would need to be made about where you put the copper that's available. And that's something actually I hadn't thought about too much, is that we might start prioritizing where copper can go first, what requirement it goes into first, not just a completely freely traded commodity on an open market. I hadn't really thought about that, but that is interesting. A restricted commodity.
That could very well end up being the situation. If we go back to wartime, they dictated what product was to be used for if it was necessary to the war effort. So if we need to green and decarbonize the economy, that's a possibility. Not only is it become a critical metal, but it becomes a priority metal.
Yes, so in which case, to go back to the housing example, there could be an edict coming out saying there's no more copper pricing going in housing. It's all going to be poly or something else.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Well, we've got a problem. There's going to be lots of talk about how to solve it, and I'm sure you and I are going to be able to discuss that, and I'm sure our paths are going to cross again someplace else in the world. It was certainly nice to meet you and talking with you in London, and I look forward to the opportunity to see you again. If my audience wants to reach out to you or learn more about what you folks are doing, how would they do so?
Yeah, so they can go to our website, imdexlimited.com. They can find me on LinkedIn. As I mentioned right at the start, my surname is spelled Lawie. There aren't many of those names on the planet. If you put that in, you'll find me pretty quickly. You can get hold of me there.
And how would you spell IMDEX?
M for mother, so not N. So IMDEX.
Wonderful. Till the next time, thank you very much for joining me, Dave, and I look forward to continuing this chat somewhere down the road.
Yeah, hopefully I'll catch you at PAC, Mike.
That sounds like a plan. I'll be there with bells on.
Great to see you there.
The Prospector News podcast is for educational purposes only. The opinions expressed are those of the participants and are not to be taken as investment advice. Listeners need to do their own due diligence and seek advice of a licensed investment advisor.